China boasts the world's largest standing military, with over 2 million active personnel. The People's Liberation Army also possesses advanced weaponry, including aircraft carriers, stealth fighters, ballistic missile submarines, and a massive nuclear arsenal. On paper, China's military appears formidable, and its recent assertiveness has raised alarm bells across the Asia-Pacific region. However, beneath the surface, the PLA suffers from serious deficiencies and vulnerabilities that would severely hamper its ability to achieve victory in a major conflict. China's military power should not be overestimated. Corruption and mismanagement hampers the PLA. Perhaps the biggest weakness of the PLA is pervasive corruption throughout its ranks. Ever since Deng Xiaoping allowed the PLA to engage in business activities and profit from them in the 1980s, the military has become an enormous money-making enterprise rife with graft. Over 160 generals have been investigated for corruption since Xi Jinping initiated an anti-corruption drive. Among them are two former vice chairmen of the Central Military Commission, Xu Kehu and Guo Boxiong. Xu made billions of dollars selling promotions to top military positions. Investigators found over 1 ton of cash when raiding his mansion. Guo likewise embezzled an estimated $3.2 billion through kickbacks and land deals. Corruption is not limited to the top brass. Buying and selling of ranks has permeated down to lowly squad leader positions. Units routinely falsify training logs, embezzle supplies, and smuggle goods across borders. Much of the military budget lines the pockets of officers rather than providing for proper training and maintenance. This rampant corruption has severely undermined the PLA's combat capabilities. Units with corrupt commanders often lack basic necessities and discipline. Equipment goes unrepaired while funds are siphoned off. Under Xi Jinping, over 18,000 PLA officers have been demoted or expelled for graft, but the problem likely remains deeply ingrained. In addition to corruption, the PLA suffers from mismanagement and outdated organizational structures. The army was structured for a mass mobilization war that is unlikely to occur today. Command systems are bloated and inefficient. Unit cohesion is poor due to constant personnel turnover and a lack of professional NCO. These issues critically weaken the PLA's ability to fight modern combined arms warfare. Lack of combat experience. Another major deficiency of China's military is an almost complete lack of combat experience. The PLA has not fought a major war since its disastrous defeat by Vietnam in 1979. Only a tiny fraction of personnel have any first-hand experience in battle. With no recent combat experience, the PLA has been unable to test tactics and doctrine under fire or blood new commanders. Real-world fighting cannot be perfectly replicated through training. The stresses, chaos, and lethality of war inevitably expose weaknesses that are not apparent in peacetime. For example, Russian forces were judged quite capable before invading Ukraine, but once in combat, poor morale, tactical incompetence, and technical failures produced military disaster. China could face similar nasty surprises in a real war as its forces confront the brutal realities of combat for the first time in over 40 years. Doctrine ill-suited for modern warfare. In line with its lack of combat experience, much of the PLA's doctrine and training remains outdated and ill-suited for the demands of modern high-tech warfare. Chinese military doctrine emphasizes frontal assault, attrition warfare, and reliance on numbers over maneuver or combined arms. For instance, amphibious landing exercises feature human wave attacks against fortified beaches. In reality, such massed infantry would be slaughtered by precision missiles and cluster munitions before reaching shore. The PLA has also demonstrated only limited ability to coordinate air, naval, and ground forces in joint operations. While China is working to reform doctrine, training cycles focused on rigid, scripted exercises make it difficult to instill initiative and flexibility at lower levels. At present, the PLA would likely struggle to adapt to fluid, modern battlefields. Its forces are better prepared for the industrial age wars of the past than the high-tech conflicts of the future. Poor logistics and sustainment. Logistics are the lifeblood of any military force, but remain a key liability for China. The PLA lacks the transport capacity to swiftly move large numbers of troops and supplies over long distances or overseas. Its few large transport planes and fleet of aging helicopters are insufficient for a large airlift campaign. Sea lift is bottlenecked by a small inventory of landing ships. Resupply across the Taiwan Strait alone would stretch the PLA Navy to its limits. Establishing sea lines of communication to sustain forces at distance abroad would pose an even greater challenge. Slow mobilization and restricted logistics would provide major advantages to opponents. Difficulties with transportation also affect PLA ground forces. Mechanized units lack enough heavy equipment transporters, forcing tanks and artillery to travel long distances on their own at the expense of engines and tracks. Ammunition and fuel convoys are vulnerable without dedicated escort vehicles. Forward units could easily end up stranded without supplies under combat conditions. Inadequate force protection. Chinese troops also suffer from inadequate personal protective equipment and force protection. Most PLA soldiers do not have access to basic gear like ballistic armor or helmets. Night vision devices are scarce outside of elite units. Foxholes, blast barriers, and camouflage are often an afterthought. This lack of force protection would result in needlessly high casualties against an adversary equipped with large amounts of precision firepower. Pictures from exercises show troops congregating in the open, presenting inviting targets. The PLA has traditionally regarded soldiers as expendable and neglected survival measures. This attitude requires urgent reform to reduce unnecessary losses. Shortfalls in key protective systems likewise persist. Forward operating bases lack adequate air defenses and suffer from ammunition shortages. Landing ships have minimal defenses against anti-ship missiles. Aircraft are not properly equipped with missile countermeasures and sensors. Addressing these vulnerabilities will be crucial if the PLA wishes to survive under intensive fire. Unreliable technology and inexperienced personnel. China touts an array of cutting-edge military hardware, including stealth fighters, unmanned systems, and railguns. However, while great in number and outward appearance, many PLA weapons and equipment suffer from serious deficiencies underneath. One issue is technology reliability. Chinese engines, electronics, and mechanical parts consistently demonstrate failure rates far higher than their Western counterparts. This results in aborts during fighter missions, breakdowns of tanks and trucks, and loss of ships at sea. China's advanced systems are newly developed and have had little operational testing. Their performance in real combat remains questionable. For example, the latest Type 055 destroyers appear imposing but have a troubled propulsion system. The new Type 002 aircraft carrier has yet to demonstrate full integration with a carrier air wing. Compounding matters is a lack of experienced and properly trained personnel. Complex systems like submarines, stealth aircraft, and air defenses require highly skilled operators honed through years of intense training. However, the PLA lacks institutional experience operating such technologies. Most crews will be relatively green with little hands-on practice. This combination of unreliable equipment and novice operators does not inspire confidence in China's ability to effectively leverage its modernized arsenal. Training shortcuts could prove catastrophic in combat situations. Weaknesses in China's nuclear deterrent. A core mission of the PLA is maintaining a credible nuclear deterrent to prevent nuclear coercion or attack. China fields a nuclear triad ICBM, bombers, and ballistic missile submarines SSBN. It is also constructing hundreds of new silos, suggesting rapid nuclear expansion. However, China's nuclear forces suffer from serious limitations. Its ICBM force relies on liquid-fueled and silo-based missiles. These would be highly vulnerable to preemptive strikes in a nuclear crisis. Bombers are few in number and rarely conduct long-range training missions. Most importantly, China's SSBN fleet is still developing and far behind Western counterparts. It currently has only 6 Jin-class SSBN, 2 of which are undergoing trials and not fully operational. By comparison, the U.S. has 14 Ohio-class SSBN, all fully active. Each U.S. boat carries 3 times as many warheads as the Chinese. With so few active nuclear submarines, China can almost never have one stationed nearby the U.S. coast for prompt retaliation. Its entire SSBN fleet could also likely be tracked and eliminated by U.S. attack submarines in a war. This leaves China's nuclear deterrent on shaky footing. TLA Air Force weaknesses. Dominance of the air will be decisive in any Chinese military campaign, but the People's Liberation Army Air Force faces steep challenges. Most concerning is an acute lack of practical training and skills among pilots. Flying hours average 100 to 150 per year for PLA-AF crews compared to 200 to 300 for U.S. crews. Complex exercises such as strike packages and multi-aircraft formations are rarely practiced. Pilots thus lack the proficiency needed against competent opponents. The PLA-AF also has no meaningful experience coordinating with surface forces for joint maritime operations. Hardware shortcomings also persist. China is struggling to build high-performance jet engines and relies heavily on Russian imports. The PLA-AF huge fleet of over 2,000 fighters is mainly outdated types like the J-7 and J-8. Just a small number are modern designs. Stealth and dogfighting capabilities remain suspect. Logistics and maintenance are strained supporting so many different aircraft types. The PLA-AF also needs more strategic tankers and airlifters to project power further abroad. While rapidly expanding, the air arm remains primarily oriented towards national defense and requires much further development. PLA Navy weak at open ocean operations. China boasts the numerically largest navy in the world. However, the PLA Navy suffers from serious capability gaps, especially in blue water operations distant from shore. Most vessels were built for coastal defense and have limited endurance. For instance, the PLAN's two aircraft carriers cannot project power beyond the first island chain due to lack of escorts and logistics. Its cruiser and destroyer fleet is only now transitioning from shore defense to multi-mission open ocean vessels. Underway replenishment is limited, constraining the fleet's range and sustaining power abroad. Amphibious warfare is another weakness. The PLAN has enough transport capacity to move just one mechanized division, far smaller than the force needed to conquer Taiwan. Landings would depend on vulnerable civilian ferries. Naval fire support, minesweeping, anti-air, and ship-to-shore mobility all remain inadequate. Subsurface warfare is a mixed picture. While the PLAN operates a sizable force of diesel submarines, they are best suited for coastal defense. Nuclear attack subs are still noisy and easily tracked in the open ocean. The U.S. maintains a decisive undersea advantage that forces in China's near seas would be hard-pressed to overcome. PLA Army prioritizes numbers over ability. With 1 million active troops, the PLA Army enjoys sheer size. However, major deficiencies in professionalism and modernity persist. The Army was downsized in recent years to cut ineffective personnel, but the move to a fully volunteer, professional force remains incomplete. The PLA Army suffers from an overabundance of light infantry without adequate mechanization. Mobility over vast distances is heavily dependent on antiquated trucks rather than tracked vehicles. Fire support is limited due to a lack of sufficient artillery in Army aviation. Night fighting capacity also lags behind leading global militaries. Ground forces reform has focused more on brigade restructuring than improving combat capabilities. While now better organized, most brigades remain far less skilled than U.S. counterparts. They rely on rote scripting of events rather than realistic free play against active opponents. This produces poor initiative among commanders and inability to cope with unforeseen situations. Weaknesses and vulnerabilities constrain China's military power. In summary, while making great strides in some areas in recent years, the PLA still suffers from serious deficiencies and vulnerabilities. It lacks combat experience, modern doctrine, force protection measures, and joint operations skills. Training and professionalization are inadequate. Technological reliability, human capital, logistics, and sustainment all fall short. Critical weaknesses persist in contingencies like a Taiwan Strait conflict that the PLA has supposedly prepared and oriented itself towards for decades. Victory here is far from assured. Even local superiority vis-a-vis Taiwan is tenuous. Projecting military power further into the Pacific against capable opponents like the US or Japan would be even more improbable given China's current capabilities. The PLA clearly remains a work in progress rather than a world-class force prepared to dominate abroad. China's military weaknesses mean the US and allies still decisively outmatch Chinese forces in the Indo-Pacific. Maintaining this edge requires sustained efforts to shore up deterrence. However, China's Achilles heels also provide opportunities for engagement if Beijing shows restraint. China's military limitations and vulnerabilities should therefore be accounted for in formulating balanced policy and strategy.